Hey guys, and welcome to today's video. So in this video, I'm going to be covering off what it's like to use the MacBook Pro from 2012 with Retina display for a whole week, since my MacBook Pro 16-inch had a very unfortunate incident where unfortunately an iPhone smashed it in the screen and no longer have a display. So whilst that is getting repaired, we're doing one video on this and what it's like to use it as my primary device for a whole week with nothing else. And next week I'll be doing one on what it's like to use the iPad Pro 12.9 as my primary device. So both of those are going to be taxing. So let's find out my thoughts, what I liked about this, how it could be used in your day-to-day workflow, and what I absolutely hated about it, because there are a few things. Let's get on with the video, shall we? So first up, to cover off the spec of this thing. So this is the original MacBook Pro 2012 model with the very first Retina display that they put into the MacBooks. And I absolutely love it. It's been a workhorse for me and it has lasted so long. Mine comes with 8GB of RAM, 128GB SSD, and it's the 13-inch model. So you know what? It's an all-around pretty decent package. In terms of the battery cycle, it's one thing that I'll quickly mention now. I've checked and it's 630 cycles on this thing, so most of the time it's spent plugged in at a desk, so it hasn't really cycled too many times considering how old this thing is. But I get about 2 hours of battery life, so it's always worthwhile checking those things out if you are in the market for something like this and you're after something with half decent battery. So first up, the things that I really liked about this. And the first one is, of course, it's the ports on it. I have missed those ports so much. Now, I have nothing against USB Type-C. In fact, I actually quite like it. And I have dongles galore kicking around the house because I need them so many times. And most of the times I only need a dongle when I'm at a desk or something like that. So it's not too bad just to have one plugged into a monitor with a dock and stuff like that. However, it has just been so nice having those ports back on here without having to reach for a dongle. If I'm in the living room, for example, and I need to get a mouse plugged into it, or if I want to plug in a USB, then I have that functionality and it's fantastic. Being able to take a memory card out of a device and just plug it straight into the SD card slot, you just don't know what you're missing until you finally go back to it. Ports aside, the one thing that I really didn't realise how much I missed was Magsafe. Now, Magsafe, for those of you who don't know, is the little magnetic charger that kind of clips onto the side, and it makes it so easy just to kind of clip it off and then, you know, take your MacBook off somewhere else. But it also saves it from more unfortunate accidents. Now, I have a toddler, and they have a real bad habit of just running around everywhere. And the amount of times my MacBook Pro 16-inch has almost gone flying because, you know, the USB Type-C cable is well and truly stuck in there. Whereas this, you know, he's run through the cable a couple of times, it's just snapped out. Save my MacBook, save the toddler as well, but obviously more important to save the MacBook. So yeah, MagSafe, there are rumours that it's coming back to the next line of MacBooks, but yeah, I have missed that massively. Now, onto the inside of the device, and one thing that I was surprised at is I actually really enjoyed using this trackpad again. It has its flaws, and I do really enjoy the 16-inch MacBook's touchpad. The 3D touch is really good, but the one thing I've always found with 3D touch touchpads is just that, I don't know, they seem intermittent. Sometimes you'll highlight a load of files and then go to drag and drop them somewhere else, and it will only drag and drop one of the files for some reason. And you'll be scrolling through, and then instead of scrolling, you'll suddenly decide that you want to use multitasking, and it'll bring up all your different windows, which is just a bit tedious at times. Most of the time, it works really well, but there's just those really irritating times where it just kind of goes a little bit mad. With a physical click, it just seems to work pretty much all the time as I expect it to, so I didn't have any of those issues where you were trying to do one thing and then you just had to repeat yourself over and over again until 3D Touch decides it, you know, understands what you're trying to do. Now, don't get me wrong, it is a little bit on the small side, but again, I don't mind that. If you've seen my reviews of the MacBook Pro 16-inch, I've always talked about the fact that the touchpad, although it is really nice, I like having a large trackpad, it's just a little bit too large. So when you're typing, the amount of times your thumbs kind of hit that trackpad, with this, it's pretty much just about the right size. It would be nice to have a little bit bigger, but it doesn't get in the way. If you're typing, you're not going to accidentally click it. So that was one really nice thing. Another thing to absolutely mention in terms of ergonomics and input methods on this is keyboard is still to this day one of my favorite keyboards to use. It has a really good amount of key travel on there, and you can really feel those clicks and types, and you don't get any missed key presses. It's just a nice, well-spaced, good, decent travel keyboard. So absolutely recommend it if you are somebody who's going to be doing a lot of typing. The new scissor keyboard on the MacBook Pro 16-inch is what drew me to that model, and I thoroughly do enjoy that keyboard. But anything before that, unless you're going back quite a way, it has the butterfly keyboard. So you know what? This is actually a really good, typing proposition if you're in the market for something like a MacBook and some typing. Battery life is half decent. I was able to get about 2 hours of solid use of it when it wasn't plugged in, so actually it's not too bad. It's definitely not something I'd feel comfortable if I was working out in the field, but you know, in this day and age where you're not really allowed outside of your house, that's not too much of an issue. But it's decent enough when I leave the office and go downstairs or go anywhere else where I'm being able to use this, so actually it's not too bad. Now, moving on to the next part of this video, we're going to have to kind of discuss a little bit about my workflow so you can see what parts of that fit into what you do and why you might consider this and why it might not be right for you and why it might be right for you. So obviously we do a lot of video editing considering we have the YouTube channel, so there's a lot of video going into this. Most of the footage is shot on an iPhone 11, so you know, bear that in mind. We're not using anything that is, you know, massively intensive. We don't have any professional cameras, so you know, when we talk about editing 4K footage, it's stuff from an iPhone. The other things that we do a lot of is obviously we have to do a lot of design work as well, things like banners for the website, article writing, and then also as well I do a lot of things like newsletters and correspondence for different companies that I work with. There is a lot of typing involved, there is a lot of email involved, and a lot of web browsing to do things like our research that we need to get articles and videos put together. So all in all, a massive part of this job is all about using our MacBooks on a day-to-day basis, and they get a lot of use. So first up, let's talk about that video editing, because that's probably going to be one of those things that's quite important to a lot of people. If you've come through today, you might be looking to pick yourself up something, you know, for around about $300 to $400 or pounds that's going to be able to do a half decent job. And you know what? This still does a half decent job. It doesn't do it amazingly well, and it can be very sluggish. But what I did find is that you can comfortably edit 4K footage. Again, like I said, it's 4K footage that's been shot on my iPhone 11. However, I could edit it and I could put together most of the videos that I needed to. This video has been all completely edited on this MacBook, and to be fair, it does a pretty decent job. Where things start to fall apart, however, is if you're editing, I suppose, large amounts of B-roll. So for example, our unboxing videos, we'll normally have one camera that's shooting me and then another camera that is shooting down at the product we're unboxing. When we try to overlay that in something like iMovie, it just can't do it. When it becomes anything larger than a 30-second piece of footage you're putting over something else, the timeline just crashes and it becomes unbearably slow to the point you just can't edit it. So bear that in mind. Putting B-roll into the timeline isn't necessarily too bad so long as it's less than 30 seconds. Most of the time this thing could edit those streams, and I was able to edit it pretty comfortably. The one thing that you will absolutely need to bear in mind when you're doing any kind of editing, especially if it is for something like YouTube, is the audio quality of this device. Now, it's not necessarily bad, and it certainly wasn't bad for the time. However, when it comes to actually editing those videos, the audio is very flat and quite tinny, and it's not an overall good experience. You can't get an idea if there's any echo in the room or how that audio actually sounds. So it's definitely something to bear in mind. You'll either need to get an external speaker for it or edit using some headphones as well. It's not a deal breaker, but if you're wanting an all-in-one device, and I've been spoiled by the way the MacBook Pro 16-inch handles its audio, then you know this is going to be a bit of a letdown. However, for the most part, it does what I needed it to do. And if you are somebody who's wanting to keep your budget relatively low and not spend an absolute fortune, then actually this thing will do the job. It only starts to fall apart, like I said, when you have multiple streams of 4K in your footage that you're trying to edit, and then things can get a little bit cumbersome for it. Where things felt a little bit glaring and quite frustrating was actually in the operating system as a whole now. Now, previously in my video that I did of this in 2020 about whether or not it's still a decent device, I talked about the fact that it felt as snappy as it did when I first got it. That's absolutely not the case this year round, and it's because I made the mistake of updating it to Catalina. So I'd always held off updating this device, but when I restarted it and got it going again, it automatically did an update, and I stupidly forgot to stop it from doing that. And since it's been updated to Catalina, things have just been a little bit slow and sluggish. The operating system itself is pretty responsive, but it's things like opening up Chrome browser, that's when things really start to fall apart. Just opening some web pages, things take a long time to load, and especially if there are a lot of images on there. Even with things like PowerPoint and Word, there were times when I tried to open up a presentation or a Word document and it would take a good couple of minutes before it actually did anything. And it didn't show any signs that those files were opening, so half the time I was just sat waiting and hoping that it was actually doing what I wanted it to, and then it would kick into life. Now, bear in mind that this is an old machine now, so it kind of is understandable, but it is frustrating that it's something like the software from Catalina that has just absolutely slowed this thing down. Now, I could roll it back to a previous version of the operating system, but I didn't necessarily want to mess around with that at the time. It's just going to be used for a week, but again, your mileage may vary. It's not show-stopping. It's absolutely not the worst thing in the world. It's still pretty responsive and pretty snappy, but there were some slowdowns on there that were pretty noticeable. A couple of other things that kind of broke up my workflow was the fact that I wasn't able to use Sidecar anymore because this device just doesn't support it. Now, Sidecar is where you use your iPad as an external monitor, and I absolutely love using that feature, especially when I'm away from my monitor, which is downstairs in the office, and I want to be able to use something up here. Unfortunately, just can't do that. So that is something that's lacking on here. I also can't unlock it with my Apple Watch because it's not supported on this model, but again, typing in my password, that's very much a first world problem. It's not a massive deal breaker. All in all, using this thing for a week has been an experience. It does pretty much everything that I need it to, and it does it reasonably well. There are obviously some slowdowns on here, but I would absolutely expect it to be slower than something like my MacBook Pro 16-inch because it's a very old device now. It came out in 2012. So to answer the question as to whether or not I could use this as my daily driver, the answer is yes, I could, but I would definitely have to make some sacrifices. Things like editing video would definitely become slower. The export time takes absolutely ages. We're talking hours as opposed to something like 10 minutes on my MacBook Pro 16-inch. The other thing that really starts to fall down, like I said, is if you're editing multiple pieces of 4K footage in one video, it just starts to get very slow and sometimes it just doesn't even work. The overall operating system itself and doing day-to-day tasks like browsing on the web, checking out our emails, and doing documents and editing on the go, it works reasonably well. There are a few slowdowns and hiccups, but I could pretty much do everything that I needed to on this device, and it still handled everything. You know, the things that stood out are things like the slowdowns in the operating system, opening up things like Word documents, PowerPoints taking a couple of minutes. But again, they're all first world problems, and this thing still holds up really well today. If I was in the market and I could get one of these for around about £300 or $300, I'd say that's a pretty good deal. It will do pretty much everything you need to, especially if you are a new YouTuber or something like that and you just need something that's going to be able to do a decent job, then this is still up there in my opinion. Just check the battery cycles. Like I said, mine has 630 battery cycles on here and it gives me about 2 hours of battery. So bear that in mind. You might get one that's had a lot more hammer in terms of the battery and just not really last and constantly need to be plugged in. This thing has been interesting to use again, and I am not going to miss it when I go back to my MacBook Pro 16-inch when it finally gets back from repair, which hopefully is going to be at some point in the near future, because otherwise I am going to be even more balding than I was before, if that's possible. So I hope you've enjoyed that video, and if you're looking to see me really stressed out next week, then be sure to subscribe and come along for using the iPad Pro 12.9-inch as my daily driver for a week, because that's going to be really interesting and challenging. Let me tell you, I've already had a bit of a play with it as my daily driver just for half a day. I didn't like it. So yeah, next week is going to be very interesting. If you have any questions at all, be sure to throw them in the comments below. We'll be back in the future with some more awesome content as always, and I will have a lot less hair, I promise you that. In the meantime, stay safe and we'll see you soon. Bye.